Good evening, Jillian and Jonathan. So tonight we are talking about the Iraq War. Now this is not to be confused with the Gulf War. The Gulf War, the air portion of the Gulf War began at the end of 1990. The land invasion comes in 1991. That was a successful war that drove Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. But you'll remember that President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, Bush 41, as he became known, stopped short. As soon as we had convincingly driven the Iraqis out of Kuwait, ended the threat to Saudi Arabia's oil fields, it was decided we didn't want to overthrow Saddam Hussein because we thought there might be a chaos in the vacuum. At least that's what the White House thought. So they stopped pursuing the Iraqi troops, and things settled down into a tense normal for another decade. We did extend fighter cover over northern Iraq and essentially adopted the Kurdish region of northern Iraq as clients. We provided them with money and with weapons and with air cover over them so Saddam could not attack them. So effectively, we broke off northern Iraq from the rest of Iraq, where the Kurds had lived in northern Iraq, and they came to see America as their protectors. They weren't technically independent, but Baghdad didn't control what went on in there. The Kurds controlled their own lives, thanks to American support. But Saddam is still in Baghdad. Saddam is still a dictator who brooks no opposition, and Washington was okay with that, more or less. Then 9/11 happened. When the 9/11 attacks happened, we invaded Afghanistan. Something changed. Exactly what, it's hard to say. There is a faction in American circles that's called Neoliberalism. And there were neoliberals in the second Bush administration, George W. Bush's, Bush 43's administration, especially around Vice President Dick Cheney, who they hate dictators. They want freedom for people. They think America should be a freedom building machine around the world. Sounds good to me. But they feel American military power should from time to time be used to foster that freedom. So that was in the mix. Saddam was clearly a brutal dictator. And there were people in this neoliberal faction who believed that a free Iraq, an Iraq with liberal democracy and free market economics, could become a kind of building block for a pro-Western, successful, prosperous Arab Middle East. They thought that Iraq had a lot of potential to be the most successful of all Arab countries. It has lots of oil. It does have a heritage of free market, free enterprise. I can see where they'd get that. But of course, they've got this brutal dictator in charge. So there were quiet things being said all along that it was a mistake to have left him in charge back in 1991, and that Iraq should be freed from the tyrant's yoke. All that was just talk until 9/11. And then, of course, the idea that there could be any Muslim majority country, any country in the Middle East that might be a breeding ground for terrorists became very much a concern for us. There was some evidence, apparently, and we learned not very much at all, that there might be some terrorist training camps in the mountains of eastern Iraq. It turned out, afterwards we found out there were none. There was some evidence reported that maybe Saddam Hussein was talking about selling his weapons of mass destruction to terrorists like Al-Qaeda. It doesn't look like those talks, if they happened at all, ever went very far. But one thing to keep in mind, Saddam Hussein almost certainly still had weapons of mass destruction. Now, here's the thing about Saddam. In an effort to end American and other Western sanctions against him, he had pledged in the 90s to end his programs for weapons of mass destruction. We know he had chemical weapons. We know he had nerve weapons, nerve gas weapons. He had used them against the Iranians during their war between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. And we know he had dropped poison gas on Kurds in the north of Iraq. These were beyond any question. So to buy his way back into a more normal standing in the world, he pledged to get rid of his chemical weapons program and to stop his nuclear weapons program. And UN inspectors were supposed to go in periodically and certify there were no chemical weapons in Iraq and there was no nuclear program. So the UN was supposed to go in and keep this ongoing oversight of Iraq so they could be a normal country, even though they had this dictator. Does that make sense? The UN is supposed to be keeping an eye on him. For reasons that are still kind of hard for us to fathom, in 2002, after the American attack on Afghanistan, Saddam began giving the UN inspectors looking for chemical weapons a hard time. He started denying them access to places they wanted to see. Now, what it looks like was going on in his head was, I want the Americans to be scared of me so they won't attack me. It looks like he was trying to tell us, I could launch chemical weapons against Israel or your other friends and your own troops if you attack me. That seems to be what was going on in Saddam Hussein's head and why he didn't want UN inspectors checking on his chemical weapons anymore. And it also seems that he wanted the world to think he was close to developing a nuclear bomb. But here's the problem. It looks like Saddam wanted the U.S. to think that, and by George, we did. The CIA became convinced he had a chemical weapons program and that he was steaming ahead with a nuclear bomb program, and we were bound and determined that he would not keep either. So we started insisting, you must let those inspectors in. If you don't, we will attack you. And Saddam, for reasons nobody now can tell you, pushed this way too far. It looks like he was trying to fake us out. But instead, he convinced us he did have these things, and we weren't going to stand by and let him get more. So we went to the UN and got a resolution that could at least broadly be considered to be a cover to attack him for not letting the inspectors do their job and for potentially having an illegal nuclear program. Here's the thing. After the war was fought, the big war at least was fought, our inspectors scoured that country. They found a couple of warehouses full of very, very old chemical weapons. 30-year-old chemical weapons from back during the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s. No new weapons at all. The nuclear program that he had was trivial. A couple of scientists mucking about in a lab who got nowhere. Why in the world he pushed this as far as he did, I don't think anybody can tell you today. It's got to be one of the most gross miscalculations in the history of diplomacy if he thought this would keep us from going to war against him, because he guaranteed we would go to war against him by doing this. He totally misread President Bush and his advisors if he thought that was going to work. Anyway, we get this resolution from the UN, and Congress backs it by a close vote. The use of force to force compliance with UN resolutions about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And in March of 2003, the United States attacked Saddam Hussein. We attacked him by air. We attacked him on the ground. Armored columns, the British helped. Armored columns went in and, just like in 1991, blew the Iraqi army away. In 1 month, we were in Baghdad. In another month, we had captured every city in Iraq. Some people welcomed us with rejoicing for having overthrown the tyrant. Those were mostly Shia and Kurds. Saddam Hussein had been a Sunni Muslim, and although he was a secularist, not a Muslim fanatic or anything, he had favored Sunni Muslim Arabs, not Shia Muslim Arabs. In fact, many Shia felt he had persecuted them, even though they were about 55% of the population. They felt Saddam had favored the minority Sunni population, his own ethnic group. The Kurds also, of course, hated him and were delighted we'd gotten rid of him. There was serious fighting only in one city. Really fierce fighting went on in Fallujah. U.S. Marines took a couple of weeks of fierce, bad fighting to win that. But most of Iraq was taken in a relative breeze. So much so that the next month after we captured Fallujah in that tough fight, President Bush wanted to celebrate the great success of our armed forces. He flew in a fighter jet. He didn't fly it, but he was in the passenger seat. He had been a fighter pilot in the National Guard in the 1960s. So he flies in a flight suit onto an aircraft carrier. There's a big banner behind him saying "Mission Accomplished" in May of 2003. This looks like a spectacular American success, and only one major battle that cost serious American lives. President Bush's popularity soared as it does after a successful war. And then in June, not even a month after the mission accomplished banner on the aircraft carrier, something started happening. American troops driving down the road in their Humvees were being blown up by car-side bombs. Rockets started soaring into American bases in Iraq from outside. Truck bombs started blowing up in Shia neighborhoods. This became known as the insurgency. Some of the people doing these things had been part of Saddam Hussein's army. Almost all of them were Sunni Muslims who had benefited from Saddam's dictatorship and resented the fact the Shia majority now was in position to start benefiting from the new Iraq. And all of them who were in this insurgency hated the fact America was there. Foreign invaders, as they saw us. Now, we were committed to democracy, human rights, the stuff America stands for. And if we want democracy, it probably means Shia are going to be the majority of parliament, and Shia will probably elect the president. But many Sunnis who had been favored under Saddam saw America as taking sides with the Shia and came to despise our presence there. So we wound up with the Shia seeing us as protectors at first, and the Sunni as invaders, and car bombs going off everywhere, and a kind of chaos that meant Iraq could not have a normal political life like we wanted. It couldn't even have a normal economic life like we wanted, because you try to run the power plant, the electricity grid, and insurgents blow up 25 poles a night. You can't do it. Iraq proved to be a bloody mess. For 2.5 years, things seemed to get worse by the month. Americans were killed on a regular basis by an enemy we couldn't even see. Well, finally, in January of 2007, President Bush began what was known as the surge, meaning a really increased number of American troops. 30,000 additional troops, then more, then more, then more. We blanketed Iraq with American troops, and yeah, there were casualties. But we also began to find Sunni willing to work with us, even if we had to pay them to work with us. And so the surge proved to be successful. Some Sunni helped us. Sunni militia were formed that were willing to work with the national Shia government. It cost us money, but we did slowly develop positive relationships with the Sunni. And the surge worked. By November of 2008, President Bush could sign an agreement with Iraq to pull American troops out by 2011. So a relative peace came to Iraq by 2009, 2010. Now, when I say a relative peace, there's still lots of political trouble. The economy's still a mess. There are protests in the streets and still occasional violence. But the insurgency basically was broken by 2009. In January 2012, when President Obama took office, America removed the last of our combat troops. So the Iraq War ends in January 2012, 9 years after we went in. Now, we wouldn't get to stay out because after 2013, ISIS appears on the scene. They are actually an outgrowth of an Al-Qaeda group in Iraq, but they took over pieces of northern Syria and little bits of northern Iraq, began to build an army of fanatics, and eventually they would invade Iraq and capture the second biggest city there, Mosul. In fact, they would at one point control almost a quarter of Iraq until we finally, with American help, lots of fighting by the Iraqi army, American air support, some American advisors on the ground, Iranian help, finally ISIS was broken a couple of years ago and Mosul was liberated and they were driven out and more or less destroyed. But, Iraq still is a long way from a normal country today. Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow.